Dracula Chapter 6. So we looked at the end of Chapter 5. We saw a series of letters and journal entries from a number of characters. We had the letters between Mina and Lucy and the journal entries from Seward. We had an invitation from Morris, and we had a telegram from Homeward. So now we move on to Chapter 6, and it starts off with Mina Murray's journal. So Mina arrives in Whitfield. Oh, sorry, I apologize. Mina arrives in Whitby. Lucy starts to sleepwalk in this chapter. Dr. Seward finds out exactly what Renfield is eating. And Mr. Swales talks of lies, suicide, and death. So chapter 6 is set in Whitby. There is an image of the town. And the first diary entry we look at is on the 24th of July, which is almost a whole month after Jonathan began his escape from Dracula's castle. So it's the idea of what has actually happened. Has he managed to escape? Where is he? Of course we know because we've read the book, and we know he is currently recuperating in a convent. So this chapter is made up of Mina's diary or journal entries and Dr. Seward's journal entries, and both of these are serve to forward the plot. Neither of them are sequential or chronological. So just to let you know in terms of the text as a whole. So Whitby, as you can see, is a lovely looking town. It's set in Yorkshire, and it's historically a whaling port where Captain Cook, I think the explorer in Pocahontas, the Disney's Pocahontas, if you haven't seen it, he began his voyages. And remember again, Victorian society is all about discovery and voyage and going out on exploration. So Stoker's novel has certainly made Whitby incredibly popular to the point where it's actually hosts two Gothic festivals every year, and I think Stoker did a great deal for Whitby's tourist trade. And as you read through this chapter, and especially the descriptions of Whitby, it could almost be a travel guide, really. And the descriptions are very accurate, and not much has changed. So we look at, Mina describes Whitby as a lovely place. There's a little river, a great viaduct, and the valley is beautifully green. We also get an insight into Whitby Abbey, which, as you can see, is full of ruins. The ruin of Whitby Abbey, which is full of beautiful and romantic bits, as Mina says. So we've got this setting, which again is stereotypically Gothic or typically Gothic. We move from this bustling metropolis. We've gone from London out to an isolated town, and this town has even got the legends of empty graves, and we've got gloomy inhabitants, and we've got ghost stories. And as the chapter develops, we've got these rambling old houses, we've got sleepwalking, otherwise known as somnambulism, we've got graveyards. It is all fulfilling the Gothic setting. And again, we are reminded that this is a Gothic text. So Stoker visited Whitby himself. He decided to set his novel here, and there's some really, really lovely descriptions up on. Sorry, I sort that out there. How I came up here alone. Okay. She doesn't always take Lucy with her. She goes and sits on this bench, and she looks out to the sea, and she clearly misses her fiance, Jonathan. And the way she's talking now, she's solid. Although she's solitary, she's not anxious and desperate like Jonathan is, but she is isolated and she is solitary. And it does, her entries here remind us of Jonathan, purely from the point of view that they are isolated. Mina appears to be a little bit detached from the society in which she lives. She doesn't really seem, remember she's a schoolmistress, she doesn't really seem to fit in with Lucy's family. She does have to work, and perhaps this is foreshadowing her role in the crew of light and her courage, because she's not a traditional Victorian woman, and we need to focus on that. We need to look at how she has developed, especially if the task is going to ask you to explore how female characters are presented. As we go to this, just this last little bit, she says, to my left, the view is cut off by a black line of roof of the old house next to the abbey. The sheep and the lambs are bleating in the fields away behind me, and there is a clatter of donkeys' hoofs up the paved road below. So the focus here is on quite on the sensory idea, the oral sense. So listening, or the sound. Okay, so she hears sheep bleating and donkeys. So we've got this idea of nature. And then she moves on to say the band on the pier is playing a harsh waltz. Along the quay, there's the Salvation Army meeting. So we've got this idea of nature and man, nature versus man, and perhaps the exploration of natural instinct versus civilized thinking. I think what Stoker might be trying to do here is emphasizing that Mina is very adaptable in terms of her outlook. She can appreciate the sounds of nature, she can appreciate the sounds of the band, she can appreciate the sounds of the Salvation Army, and she is aware of all of these, and she is able to appreciate that they each have their place. So although she describes the waltz as harsh, she is still positive in saying that it's in good time. So it's the idea that things can exist together in some form of harmony. They don't all have to be very kind of staid and uniform. And perhaps this is why she and Lucy are friends, because you wouldn't think to make them friends, because Mina is this wonderful, like I said, Renaissance woman. She's educated, she's moral, she's courageous, she's loving, she's accepting, whereas Lucy seems to be a little bit less stable, seems to be a little bit more fluffy maybe, and frivolous. So perhaps Stoker is trying to show us that it's really important, especially in terms of acceptance, that we give it a try, because Mina is obviously able to appreciate Lucy for who she is, she's much like she's able to appreciate the different music and the different sounds. On to Dr. Seward's diary, which is dated the 5th of June. So we have a break in time. Remember, the last entry of Mina's was the 1st of August. Okay. And now we got, sorry, so it's not a break, it's a we're going back in time, because Mina was on the 4th of August, 1st of August. And again, I think it's the idea that events overlap. Not all of this is happening, it's not happening in chronological order, things are happening overlapping, and we're getting different perspectives. So it might be a very good idea to make a timeline for each character and spot where particular events overlap. So now we've met Renfield, and now we're going to discover a little bit more about him. And Dr. Seward says how Renfield has developed these qualities of selfishness, secrecy, and purpose. So we need to have jumped from Mina and Lucy to the madness of Renfield. We need to understand how Renfield's madness has developed, because of course the impact is so closely linked. So it's going to go Mina, Lucy, Renfield, and then we're going to go back to the somnambulism where Lucy's sleepwalking, and she shares the same madness. So I think Stoker's using these shifts in focus and time to kind of create tension and constantly remind the reader that all these incidents are interlinked. And we're reminded back about the epigraph and how things have been carefully selected, and that the papers that they have chosen to include have been selected for a reason. Therefore, the details that they include are no details too small in these that they've included, because as the person said in the epigraph right at the beginning, anything that was not necessary has been edited out. So we see Renfield, who is a man with curious turns. In other words, he's got some strange behavior. Okay, so we've got, just to go back to perhaps Dr. Seward's journal, clearly he is, much like Jonathan, a very detail-orientated, fastidious man. He keeps records in great detail. Again, this highlights the fact that he's educated, and again, he's a doctor, but he's highlighted. He's also rational. He is a scientist, and again, we are therefore more likely to believe him, much like we believe Jonathan, because he's not, it doesn't seem to be susceptible to flights of fancy. He obviously takes his job very seriously, and he's very ambitious. But he says, note when he goes and looks in on Renfield, Renfield says, "May I have 3 days? I shall clear them away." Note the use of 3. Okay, 3 is a Kabbalist number, which means it's a supernatural or magical number, and is often used in literary for this case. So think back to Macbeth. We always had 3 witches. Think in terms of the trilogy, the God, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. They are 1 and 3 and 1 and 1 and 3. So just again, it's interesting that he has selected, "May I have 3 days?" Now, obviously, 3 days is also possibly linked to Dracula's movement in the Straits of Gibraltar, which is probably where he currently is. 18th of June. I kind of find this a little bit odd, because he's turned his mind to spiders. He's got several very big fellows in a box, keeps feeding them with flies. I am very much reminded at this point of that nursery rhyme. There was an old woman who swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly, and then she had to swallow a whole lot of other things, try and catch the fly and the cat and the dog but also the idea of when a spider says, "Come into my parlor," said the spider to the fly. It just reminds us of the idea of predators preying on the weak and the small. And again, Renfield preying on or dealing with these flies, or eating these flies, or feeding the flies, or taking the flies and feeding them to something bigger, to the spiders, mimics Dracula. It's the idea of being in control. So the fact that he seems to eat these creepy crawlies has him classified as zoophagus, ZOOPHAGOUS, which literally means eats other animals. So I suppose if you are carnivore, you are also a zoophagus, but in this case it's not necessarily referring to what we call traditional food animals like cow and pig, but in this case it's spiders and flies. So we move on to the 1st of July, and we find that we are still focused on Renfield. Seward is honest enough to say that he finds Renfield's diet and behavior absolutely repulsive, but at the same time, he clearly is fascinated by this man's behavior. It's a kind of morbid fascination when you drive past an accident on the motorway where it's usually something horrific has happened, yet we all crane our necks to have a look, and then if we do get to see anything, it's disgusting. And it's that kind of idea. Despite his repulsion, he clearly has focused on Renfield. It's the only patient we get to hear about in his diary. Note the emotive language in terms of "he disgusted me," so he really is grossed out. But also notice that despite the very odd diet, Renfield seems rather rational. Okay, so we've got this: "When a horrid blowfly, bloated with some carrion food, buzzed into the room, he caught it, held it exultantly for a few moments between his finger and thumb before I knew what he was going to put in his mouth. And it's a horrible thought." And that's exactly what Stoker wants us to respond with, because rearing flies is gross. But we need to be revolted. We need to find Renfield offensive, because he is a servant to Dracula, and we need to find Dracula offensive. He goes on to say, gave me an idea of rudiment one. I must watch how he gets rid of his spiders. He has evidently some deep problem in his mind, for he keeps a little notebook, which is always jotting down something. So there appears to be purpose, method to the madness. There appears to be purpose to Renfield's actions. And he's very focused when it comes to pursuing his mania. And obviously, Seward really wants to help this man, as we can see from this. And it even goes on to say on the 8th of July, there's a method in his madness. And he goes on in his entry marked the 8th of July to refer to him as my friend, which is quite interesting, especially since he is so disgusted by this person. So the story of Renfield, I think, is certainly foreshadowing the social disruption and the insanity which is going to accompany Dracula when he comes to England. And I think obviously Renfield's desire for blood and power mimics or mirrors that of Dracula. So perhaps we can look at this as Stoker perverting Christian ideas. For those of you who are unaware, before Jesus Christ came to earth, but before he began preaching at the age of 33, he had a predecessor. So he had John the Baptist, who came forward. He was actually Jesus's cousin, but he was a little bit older, and he came forward and started to tell everybody that Jesus was coming and they needed to be prepared for this. So maybe Renfield, much like John the Baptist, can be seen as Count Dracula's predecessor. I mean, it is really rather worrying, because Renfield does talk about Dracula. He does refer to him as his Lord and Master, which again are terms John the Baptist used to describe Christ. As we go on to the 19th of July, we realize how he's progressing, how his kills are, he starts with small and his kills are becoming bigger and bigger. It's a bit like Lenny in Of Mice and Men, if you've read it, how he starts off with a mouse and then is a puppy, etc., etc. So here Renfield is progressing. He starts with flies and spiders, and now he's asked for a kitten, which is quite worrying, especially since I am a lover of cats, and I think that is just horrid. And he does go on to say the man is an undeveloped homicidal maniac. Well, is he really? Okay, so in terms of this, let's have a look. A maniac or a madness. A maniac implies violent madness. Madness, if you look it up in the dictionary, it means to have a disordered mind. So remember, an ordered mind is defined by society. So having a disordered mind is one that society doesn't understand. So by stating that Renfield is an undeveloped homicidal maniac, implies that he is a killer, and he does a violent killer, and that he's mad. Now, so far we haven't been told that Renfield has killed anybody. He's just been shoved in the cell because of his peculiar behavior. So again, why is Dr. Seward making this assumption? It is very likely to influence us, the reader, so that we again think about Renfield negatively. At 10 p.m. Seward visits him again, and when he goes into the cell, Renfield threw himself on his knees before me and implored me to let him have a cat. Notice the language here, threw himself on his knees, so it's a position of supplication. Again, and when people pray, they go on their knees to show supplication to God. Again, there's also the use of the abstract noun salvation, again linking back to Christ and John the Baptist. On the 20th of July, we talk again about visiting Renfield, and he's now seems to have gotten over his desperate need for a sparrow, or for a cat, and now he is manifestly beginning his fly catching again. So he had the sparrow, and he wanted to feed the sparrow to the cat, but he wasn't given a cat. Now suddenly the sparrow's disappeared, and he's back to collecting the flies. So it's all very circular, and the idea that the whole plot is circular and that it's going to go round and round and round. And then we find out that he's actually at 11 a.m. we find out that he's been very sick and he's disgorged. In other words, he's burping or spewing up a whole lot of feathers. So the implication is that he has eaten these birds raw, which is just foul. Okay. At 11 p.m. we see that Renfield is given an opiate sleeping draught to make him sleep. Focus again on the motif of sleep and the idea that in sleep we do not have control, and that is when Dracula can come in to Renfield's mind and take ownership. Okay, and the thought that has been buzzing around my brain lately is complete. The theory proved my homicidal maniac is of a peculiar kind. I find that that's an example of tautology, since maniac means he's violently mad, mad means he's disordered, which means he is naturally peculiar. But that's just me being pedantic. In fact, he's given him a classification of zoophagus. So he's very excited, old Seward, because he can now classify him. He says he wonders if he really does wonder if he should allow Renfield the cat, and to see how Renfield kind of goes through this motion and the system. But of course he does say that he would come under fire for doing this, because it's a little bit odd. And he goes on to talk about how men sneered at vivisection. So vivisection is when you do surgery for scientific research. And of course nowadays, and clearly in Victorian times, but more so nowadays, there is moral implications of this. So you can't just decide that you want to find out why somebody has got a certain thought pattern, so you just dive into their brain. So there certainly are, it's the idea of some of the moral implications here. And then he goes on to talk about why not advance science in its most difficult and vital aspect, the knowledge of the brain. And of course this is the issue. Seward is clearly devoted, he's determined, he's ambitious, he wants to make a name for himself, and the brain is the part of the body that even today we still know very little about. And he says, had I even the secret of one such mind. So he wants, even if I could just work out what's going on in Renfield's mind, I would hold the key for even one lunatic. Now, again, just a reminder, the word lunatic comes from the Latin luna, which means insane, and is associated with the moon. Okay, and lunar. So just every time we read about the moon, and we read about madness, they are closely linked. And then he says, well, you know what? Compared with Burden-Sanderson's physiology means the science of living organisms, and Burden-Sanderson was in charge of public health in 1850s. He was a scientist, and he came under criticism because of his vivisections, his surgery for scientific research, and maybe not necessarily having asked permission, or maybe, a bit like, makes one think of Mengele and his experimentation on twins. So he makes reference to Burden-Sanderson. He also makes reference to Ferrier's brain knowledge. Okay, now Ferrier was a prominent Scottish neurologist and psychologist who wrote books on the function of the brain. Now this is part of the Victorian zeitgeist, because of course any educated Victorian would have known this, because these two men were famous. So it goes on to say, if there were sufficient cause. So Seward is ambitious. He really would like to be able to make a breakthrough. goes on to say that even lunatics always have their own scope. He has closed the account more accurately and dared to begin a new record. So remember, he spoke of Renfield having this book that he was making notes in. So even he believes that Renfield is really, really dedicated, and instead, in fact, more dedicated than Seward is, because Seward is, bless him, work, 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 trying to submerge himself in work. He is still smarting from Lucy's rejection, obviously this sense of unrequited love. He's still trying to recover, and he's therefore, you know, talks about the great recorder, which is a metaphor for God, and he just wishes, like Renfield, he could get focused, he could work. He realizes that working will help him heal, but he lacks the motivation. Okay, he misses Lucy. Okay, he misses the happiness that he believed Lucy would bring him, and this is a very, again, clear sieg. So we end with him talking about Lucy, and now we have a clear sieg into Mina's journal entry, and she's now going to talk about we too, much like Mina, becoming agitated. The last we knew that Jonathan was trying to escape, and we want to know what's happened. So it's building up this tension and horror. Obviously, we, because we're studying it, we know that he has escaped, but reading it for the first time, what Stoker is trying to create is a sense of horror and fear. And Lucy says, I must only pray to God for patience because a storm is coming. Okay, and she talks about how today is a grey day and the sun, as I write, is hidden in thick clouds. So it's the idea of a storm approaching, pathetic fallacy. The approaching storm implies that something horrible is about to happen. Creates a sense of foreboding. The storm also seems to really disturb Lucy. Her behavior becomes even more erratic. The idea that there's thick hidden in thick clouds is the implication that there is duplicity. Mina cannot see clearly. She's unable to see the big picture, and it builds, and the idea that there's grey fingers of mist, which is again personification. The idea that this mist is creeping in. And again, in terms of literary study, mist tends to represent confusion. So we've got this foreboding sense because, of course, Dracula is en route and our fear is building. Note there is quite a lot of repetition of the adjective grey. The idea is something terrible is going to happen. Also, the idea that nothing is straightforward. It's not black or white. There's always shades of grey, and we're not talking the 50 variety. Okay, beautiful descriptions about the clouds are piled up like giant rocks, which is a simile, again, implication of pending violence and danger, and the presage of doom. Presage means impending doom, so it's the idea that there's so much fear, the end of the world. It's almost apocalyptic. Dark figures are shrouded in mist, so again, the idea of confusion, a lack of clarity. And she ends her paragraph by saying, here comes old Mr. Swales. He's making straight for me, and I can see by the way he lifts his hat that he wants to talk. So again, we are ending with some ellipsis, which gives us the idea that the journal is in real time, and Mina has had to stop writing in order to gauge with Mr. Swales. Basically, what Swales wants to do is ask for forgiveness. He says he's really sorry about the stories and the jokes he made about death. He realizes they were inappropriate. Notice again his use of the adjective wicked, again, semantic field of religion. He's unlike the previous attempt when he was full of mischief and saying, oh, Lucy, of course nobody in one of those graves is going to get upset because you're sitting on his lap. He is now very serious, and this is reflected in the fact that he doesn't seem to speak in as much dialect. It's less obvious. So he goes on to explain that he's old and that he will die, and his jokes about death are kind of his way of dealing with the fear. And again, we've got this prediction and this foreshadowing because he is going to die literally in a few pages. Okay, so we've got the someday soon, the angel of death will sound his trumpet for me. So it's foreshadowing, but at the same time, angel of death is this personification. Okay. And he says, there's something in the wind, in the host beyond, that sounds and looks and tastes and smells like death. So he's predicting the arrival of death in the form of Dracula. Again, I know I'm repeating myself, but it's all the ideas of how does the author shape meaning. Well, you can talk about the constant use of foreshadowing, the constant use of language, repetition of specific particular phrases, etc., to be able to create the sense of doom. Okay. He goes on, he says, Lord, let me answer cheerful when my call comes. This is where I say just because he is scathing about the way the church behaves doesn't mean he doesn't believe. Please note that there is this constant reference to religion. Even someone who jokes about death, who jokes about such stuff, even he can be moved to prayer. So I think his words are very moving, because he tells us that death is obviously something tangible, and he is well aware that his days are numbered. I just don't think he realizes how numbered. They look outside, and they look out over the water, and we see a strange ship. I can't make her out, he said. She's a Russian. By Russian means she's a Russian ship, okay, by the look of her. But she's knocking about in the queerest way. Well, of course, she's going from side to side. She's not being piloted. We're going to find out in a little bit that everybody on board is dead and disappeared. So the boat is moving erratically because there's no one there steering it. So again, once more foreshadowing the uncertainty that's about to descend following Dracula's arrival in England. And Mr. Swell's last lines that says, we'll hear more of her before this time tomorrow. Not Mr. Swell's, the Coast Guard's words that we will hear more of her before tomorrow are very ominous. And again, links us to the next chapter. So we've got this clear a bridge between this one and Stoker making use of his minor characters, not only to advance the plot, but also to link the narratives.